My name is Joseph Richberg, Senior Data Architect at Penguin Random House. On today's Azure tutorials, we're going to discuss how to improve your file-based data loads. Let's begin. Here we have a pipeline with a CopyData activity, and normally to ingest one or more files, you'd go to your CopyData activity, you'd go to your Source tab, you'd create a source data set, Sync tab, create a sync data set, go to the Mapping tab, map the source to the sync, and then if you had more than one file, you would put some sort of mask here. So in this case, we're going to use CSV. And what that means is when this copy activity is running, it'll go to the directory where your source data set was created or is pointing to, and grab every file with a CSV extension. And again, we're assuming that the files have the same layout. But the problem here is this is sequential. And the way to improve performance is generally by doing things in parallel. And Azure DataFactory pipelines have, they're naturally parallel, and they actually have parallel activities. So if we go to this pipeline here, you'll see ForEach activity. They live here under the iteration and conditionals. And what a ForEach activity does is, like any other programming language, it runs when it's active, it runs through an array and it loops over that array. And every time it comes up with an item of work to do, it runs the code inside of the array. Or, I'm sorry, inside of the ForEach. So before we get into the settings, let me go into the ForEach so you could take a peek at it. And then the settings will begin to make sense. So if I double click inside or on the ForEach, you'll notice I come to another pipeline canvas, we'll call it. And you know you're in the ForEach because of up here. So this tells me the pipeline I'm in, and then this little greater than sign pointing to this icon, which is the ForEach icon, and my ForEach is actually named file loop. And as you can see, you have access to just about all of the activities you would normally have. One of the things you can't do is layer a loop in a loop. So the until and the ForEach are both not available here, right? So if I hop back out, they become available. I hop back in, they're not available. But for the most part, you can do whatever you want. So if you think about this, we'll call this an inner pipeline. And every time the ForEach loop is activated, it'll run this pipeline as though you would call it from any other location. So with that understanding, let's go back out and look at the ForEach and the settings of the ForEach. So your ForEach has 3 settings. It has items, batch count, and sequential. So let's start at the bottom. Items. This is a JSON array that the ForEach is going to iterate over. Now, as of the recording of this video, the ForEach is limited to 100,000 items to loop over. And it's a JSON array. So given that it's an array, it actually, think of it as an object with properties. So let's say that this array was actually of a person. So that person might have a name, an age, days of service. And keep that in mind because one of the things I'm going to go over next is inside of the ForEach, you need to somehow have your pipeline communicate with the loop that's running it. So keep in mind it's an array, a JSON array of objects, and those objects have properties. Okay, so now batch count. When you create a ForEach loop to start, if you just drag one on, there's a batch count is blank. And batch count is kind of, I think it's a misnomer. I prefer to think of it as max runnable. And here's why. So with nothing set in the batch count, the default is 20. What that means is when this ForEach loop is started, it will go to its array and it will start, if there are at least 20 items in the array, 20 pipelines, those internal pipelines, 20 of them will start in parallel. Now, the reason this batch count is not a good name is, so you could see it, I'll put a 5. So that means when this starts, the first thing it's going to do is start 5 of those pipelines that live inside of it. Now, as soon as one or more pipelines complete, right? Doesn't matter, fail, succeed, just complete. the ForEach is going to try to start as many pipelines to bring the running total to 5. Okay, so let's say we have 20 items in our array, and the batch count is set to 5. When this ForEach loop starts, it will start 5 internal pipelines. When one of those pipelines completes, it will say, I only have 4 running, I'm going to start one more. I have a total of 5. Now, 3 of those pipelines complete. Now the ForEach is going to say, oh, I have to start 3 more. So the batch count is how many it wants to have running at any given time. Don't think of batch count like other SQL notions, like the batch count is the number of records, right? The ForEach loop doesn't say start 5, and then as soon as all 5 are completed, start another 5 and another 5. No. This is a continuous running. It will keep up to batch count running at any given time. And that's important to keep in mind, because that may affect how you design your pipeline internally. So each of those pipelines inside of the ForEach should be independent of one another, because it's just going to clone copies of it. And then we get to the last setting, which is sequential. So if I click sequential, batch disappears. And I guess that was different than saying batch count of 1, right? Because a batch count of 1 would say just keep 1 at any given time. And I guess sequential is just a more user-friendly way of saying, hey, by the way, just to let you know, this is going to run sequentially. And now you may be thinking, oh, why would I bother with that? Why would I take all this horsepower and restrict it? Well, I'm going to be giving another tutorial which will go over, there are some limitations with data pipelines. And to overcome those limitations, we use a combination of logic apps and data pipelines. And in that case, you need it sequential. And by the way, going over logic apps and data pipelines, you'll notice this blue icon here in the items. So this is dynamic content. What this is specifically is this is a parameter. So for those of you who are not familiar with parameters in pipelines, how to use them, or how to not only how to use them in the pipeline, but how to interact with the world with them, I'll leave a link below to another tutorial I did, which goes over in great detail how to create and use parameters inside of a pipeline, but also how to call the pipeline and pass those parameters from a logic app. 100% of our pipelines right now are all driven through logic apps. We don't use the add trigger up here. Our flows and our data activities are a little too complicated just for rolling windows. And I find logic apps to have a great deal of flexibility and control, which makes using pipelines very easy, and it also makes my pipelines very optimized and, I guess what's the word I'm looking for? Minimal, right? I don't have a lot of extraneous stuff. My pipeline does just what it needs to do, whereas the logic app helps set up the environment. If you want, I can go over that in more detail. Just put a comment below that you'd like to see how logic apps and pipelines work together. I'd be more than happy to do a tutorial on that. So getting back to this, so now you have how the ForEach works and what drives it. Now let's go inside one more time, and let's look at the CopyData object. So here's my CopyData object. I have a source, a sink, and a mapping. Now I'm going to go to the source, and you're going to see something different. So what you see here in that wildcard is no longer a handwritten asterisk dot something. It's actually another dynamic content which actually interacts with the ForEach loop. So let's click here and show you. So when you click there, it brings you to dynamic content, or if I were here, I would click on that. So that's how I got to the screen. So if we go back here, what I type is ampersand or at item open close paren. So that looks like a combination of a variable declaration and a method call. And it kind of is, right? You're assigning the result to, I guess, this holder here, this placeholder. And what that says is, I would like to get information from the for each loop regarding the array item I've been assigned, right? So think about that. So the for each loop starts, and it starts at the first entry in the array, and it will start a pipeline. So now that pipeline is going to say to that for each loop, okay, I have a unit of work to do, but I need some more specific information. And at item open close paren is the way the activities inside of the for each communicate with the for each. More specifically, what this CopyData object wants to know is what's the name of the file. And if you remember, back before, since it's a JSON array and it has properties, I want the display name property in the file name array. I do finish. It gives me those little curly braces. So I still have to set up the data set. So what this says is find this specific file name in this directory. Now these are very specific, as a matter of fact. These file names are actual full file names. You don't want to put a wildcard in here because then what you're saying is, okay, take this part and run it. And I guess you could make a combination, right? If your wildcard was, let's say, numbers 10, 20, 30, 40, right? So you would want a 2, asterisk, dot, asterisk, anything with the number 2. You could have these little copy objects pulling 2 or 3 files at a time, right? So you can there's a lot of flexibility here, but in our example, these are very specific file names. Now, if we go back to the example I gave with a person object, this CopyData may have it'll have the display name. So let's say we did this and we wanted to set a variable. So here I would set a variable, and this variable, so let's do this. I have to create a variable. All right, so let's go out here and create a variable. So here, general. Oh, okay, we can't create variables in here. So not a great example for that. I have to go outside to create it, and that's a little beyond the scope of this tutorial. But if I wanted other pieces, I would just do item dot, whatever I called it. So item dot name, item dot age, etc. So we have our file, or our for each done. We have our pipeline inside the for each done. So now, if we go back, the biggest question is this batch count. So if I leave it empty, again, it's 20. And I can set a number between, 2 and 50. And you're thinking, okay, great, I'll just have everything at 50. Well, you don't want to do that. Like anything that you run in parallel, you're limited to how much data you can pull at one time. And we're coming from an Azure blob storage, so that's a lot. I mean, I think it's 60 meg per second. That's not going to be the bottleneck. And I'm going to push this into an Azure SQL Server. That's going to be the bottleneck. So I'll show you the examples. I've ran some of these already, and you'll see that what you basically have to do on your system is test your limits. What's the best way? How many files do I want to process at one time? Because that'll be a combination of the limit of the destination server and the source server. Source being, in this case, Azure. But you can use this for other things. I'm going to do another tutorial where the source is not a file, but the source is going to be another relational system. So let's hop over and look at the actual test that I did. So I go over here. So you'll see that I have a series of tests that I ran and timings. Now the first timing, the longest timing, is running the file as one large file. So the test file I have is a gzipped file, and it happens to be, I think, 130 million records. Okay, 103 million records. So I have a single zipped file. It's 103 million records, and it took it took 19 seconds, and of that I was getting about 1.2 meg per second throughput. So this is something to keep in mind, right? So this is the, quote, worst time, meaning I'm pushing everything as one file, and it's sequential, right? So to make this faster, the easiest way is to break this very large file up into multiple little files, and then you could process the data in parallel. So the source we had, I actually went and took the same data and broke it up into 30 files. So if we go to look at those, and I'll go back to here. So 19 minutes, 18 seconds to take one file with 103 million records, zipped, and move it across. So then I have this test here. So you can see this is 5, this is 10, this is 2. What do you think this one's going to be? The default, 20. And interestingly enough, with 20 running in parallel, it's a little faster. It's maybe 45 seconds faster. So let's take a look at it. So if I dig into the actual ForEach activity, right? So there's the ForEach activity. The duration of the ForEach itself took 18 minutes, 25 seconds. But now I can see the different pieces. So some of these were quick, 47 seconds. Some of these are long, 14 seconds. So let's click on the 47 second. Okay. So what this is telling me is there's about 3 million records per file, and I got about a meg per second. So if I could get this to do 2 files at the same time, I would double my throughput, right? If I get one file at 1 meg and I can get just another file running at close to that speed, I can double my throughput. And you're thinking, well, if I can run 20 of them, my throughput should be 20 times faster. Not so much. If you start looking through some of these copies, you'll see I'm getting abysmal performance, 54 kilobytes per second. This one piece of file alone took 14 minutes. And again, that's because of my back end, right? I'm still pulling files. It still doesn't take long to queue, only 2 seconds, but it's taking a long time to push. So let's go back and see what the better or the best scenario. So in this case, I went down from 20 to 10, and that improved my speed. And then I went from 10 to 5, and that improved my speed again. And then I went from 5 to 2, and that's the best performance yet. And you're thinking, that's kind of counterintuitive. How is 2 working better than 5 or 10? And as I said, your bottleneck in this case is your back end. So what you're going to want to do when you start out is you take your source files, and if you have very, very large files, you first want to think of splitting them up. You want to take, and so whatever process. So hopefully you have a process that is collecting these files, these flat files. Maybe you have a process that collects them and zips them into one large one for storage. You may want to unzip those when it comes to loading them, especially when you put them up into Azure, and find what's the best grouping for you. So in this case, as you can see, there's a 5 and a 2. There's no benefit to 5. I might as well go to 2. Maybe 3 was a little better, but I know anywhere between 5 and 2 is only going to gain me 20 seconds. So